Well, good morning, Grace Point, and happy Labor Day weekend. I hope you're doing well. Hope you're having a great weekend. Today is one of the Sundays we call a Breath Sunday, and it happens 4 times a year around a holiday weekend when there's an extra day off. Just a way to give our community, to give our volunteers and the people who work so hard, to give them a chance to enjoy some downtime and some rest and some rejuvenation. And this is Labor Day weekend. It's a weekend when we celebrate labor, and we celebrate it by, for many people, getting to take an extra day off, celebrating labor with rest. And that's actually what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about, and I want to continue our unlearning theme we've been in. I want to talk about unlearning rest and maybe give us a different way to think about our relationship to work and rest. That's because I think we've developed a kind of cultural addiction to busyness. And I think it comes out, especially for me, it comes out in the way I talk about my life. When people ask, how's it going? One of my stock responses is, oh, it's going really well. Just really, you want to fill in the term there? I wonder how many of you do it too. Just really, really busy. It's all good. We just don't know if we're coming or going. It's all good. We're just exhausted. It's all, we sort of, maybe one of the ways we try to prove our worth and value is, well, if you're exhausted, you must be really valuable. If you're exhausted, you must be working harder than everybody else, and you must be more important and more dedicated. And we sort of develop a little bit of our identity around how busy we are. Now, surprisingly, or actually, I would say unsurprisingly, the roots of busyness that we experience today are connected to our Christian faith. And you may be going, what? How is that humanly possible? When I was in grad school, we got assigned a text by a German author named Max Weber. It looks like Weber, like the grill company, but it's Weber, Max Weber. And the book is titled The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Now, how riveting does that sound? Because that's exactly how riveting it was in grad school to read this book. It's sort of a book on economics and sociology, and it's a book on how religion, specifically Protestant religion, impacted the economy in Europe, but I think this is directly applicable in our own context as well. It was based on a series of lectures Weber gave from 1904 to 1905, and it was translated into English from German in 1930. One of the specific features, and I won't bore you, it was one of those things where, you know how you go to school and you think, I remember when I was in like high school doing algebra and just thinking, I'm not going to use this on a daily basis. I thought that about Max Weber's book. I'm not going to use this ever. And here I am in a sermonette using Max Weber's work. But one of the specific features Weber pointed out was that Calvinist Christians, and if you're unaware of Calvinism or what Calvinism is, you are blessed and highly favored. But let me just describe it a little bit. One of the central features of Calvinism is this idea that there are some people who God has chosen for salvation, and there are others who aren't. The chosen are called the elect. Those who are not chosen are called reprobates, which is just a really kind and lovely term. And so one of the issues in that theological system, and he brings in other branches of non-Catholic Christians, and uses some examples from them too, but really it's the Calvinist piece of this that he drills down on. And one of the problems is when you are, everything depends on you being elect or chosen. Well, how do you know that you know that you know that you're elect or chosen? And so in this era, Calvinists began to see their success in the business world as being a sign of God's favor and God's blessing on their lives. And so the better they did in business, the more it meant and the more it confirmed to them that God had chosen them and that they were really the saved. They were one of the few elect. And what began to happen as a result of that is it led to a disintegration of an old economic model, and it ushered in a new model that we would call capitalism. But the truth is our tradition, our Jewish and Christian tradition, and our scriptures have a really different set of values than our current model that sees busyness as a virtue, that sees exhaustion as a virtue. And in our tradition and in our scripture tradition, rest is built into the very fabric of life in creation. It's this word Sabbath, which means to cease. And we often will say, yes, a Sabbath is kind of a Jewish idea, right? Yeah, absolutely. It's introduced in the Jewish scriptures. However, where it first is introduced is really interesting. It shows up in a couple of we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the Ten Commandments, it shows up there. But before it shows up in the Ten Commandments, it shows up in the first chapters of the Bible. In the first chapter of the first book, God goes around creating, right? Speaking light, speaking creation into existence. And right there in this, at the end of Genesis 1, the beginning of Genesis 2, the story kind of spills over into Genesis 2. Before there are doctrines and dogmas, before there is religion, at the beginning of creation, according to that first creation story in Genesis 1 and 2, there was Sabbath. Here's how it wraps up. At the beginning, the Genesis 1 creation story wraps up at the beginning of Genesis 2, the first few verses. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished in all their multitude. On the sixth day, God finished the work they had done, and they rested on the seventh day from all the work they had done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work they had done in creation. All right, so it's built into the creation myth. It's built into, hey, where do we come from? Well, we come from this creative act of the divine. And as a part of that creative act of the divine, God actually rests. God finishes the work God's going to do, which is another interesting bit, because God creates people to be in partnership with to continue the creative work. But then God rests. Now, I mentioned there are a few other places actually, where this idea of Sabbath is part of a command structure. And there are three versions. Most people don't know this. There are three versions, or lots of people don't maybe know. There are three versions of the Ten Commandments in the Hebrew Scriptures, which is always funny when somebody decides they're going to post those at a courthouse or at a school. Like, we need the Ten Commandments. My question is always like, which versions? Because you have a version that's probably most familiar to us in Exodus 20. We have another version that's really, really similar that is kind of familiar in Deuteronomy 5. But then there's this other version in Exodus 34, which happens after Moses breaks the original tablets, and then he comes back up and it says God's going to tell him to put the same laws on the tablets, and it's a different set of laws. There's some overlap. There is a command for Sabbath. It's just different. But it's called the ritual Decalogue. Decalogue, referring to the 10 Commandments. But it's a ritual Decalogue. And I always think that's funny. Like which one are they going to post at the courthouse? Exodus 34? Anyway, so in Exodus 20, the command for Sabbath is essentially the reason given for it is really specific. Listen to the text. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. You will not do any work, you, your son or daughter, your male or female enslaved people, your livestock, which we could stop and say, how about we don't do that, right? Of course. And it strikes me that it didn't, that in writing these commands, that it didn't, like, should we actually be owning people? Should this be the case? But what is kind of radical about this command is that it applies not just to the people in charge, but it applies to everything and everyone, the livestock, the alien resident, the foreigner in your towns. For in 6 days, here's the reason, for in 6 days the Lord made the heaven and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, but rested the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and consecrated it. So here in our section of these 10 commands, one of the big ones, one of the important things to remember is God made the earth, and when God finished God's creative act, God rested, and so you rest. But not just you, not just if you happen to be wealthy enough to be able to take a break, but this is a society-wide ceasing. Everybody, everything, all of it ceases. Exodus 34, it doesn't go into that much detail. It just says 6 days you work, but on the seventh you rest. Even in plowing and in harvest time, you shall rest. So it's interesting. Even when you're sort of up against a deadline, you still have to take that break. Then Deuteronomy 5 sounds really similar, but it adds as the reason. Remember that you were enslaved in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath. So if we look at Sabbath, it is this command, and I would argue it's actually more of an invitation than a command, but it's tied to the rhythm of creation, and it's tied to the commemoration of liberation. So rhythm of creation, commemoration of liberation. This idea of rest, this regular, refreshing, recharging rest is built into the fabric of the tradition that formed Jesus and his first followers. So with all that in mind, just a few thoughts about rest. First, I think rest is actually a form of resistance. It's a form of resistance against busyness. It's a form of resistance against exhaustion. It's a form of resistance of, maybe put it like this too. Rest is a form of resistance against our identity being co-opted. It sounds a little corny, but sometimes it's helpful to remember that we are actually human beings, not human doings, that our value and our worth is not tied to our job. It isn't tied to our bank account. It isn't tied to our 401k. It isn't tied to how exhausted we can prove we are so that people know that we're legit and we're really working hard. Rest is a form of identity that says all of those things, all of the plates I'm spinning, all the balls I'm keeping in the air, all of that matters, but I actually matter too. And if I'm going to do any of that well, I have to have a regular time of rest. When I have broken myself open and poured myself out for others, I have to have a regular time of being put back together and poured back into. And because empire depends on our unceasing, unending busyness, it will employ shame as a weapon to keep our noses on the grindstone. All right. How many of you ever find yourself in a moment where you have a little bit of downtime and you sit down and you immediately have that guilty feeling like I should be doing something. I should be productive. There's a load of laundry I should be doing right now. And if I just sit down and enjoy watching that game, watching that show, if I just sit down and close my eyes and take it, then there's something I'm not measuring up. I'm not proving my value and worth. Or as our Calvinist friends a couple hundred years ago might have said, we're not proving our chosenness, our electedness. Right? And so there's this sense that empire needs us to be busy and to be exhausted because, one, that keeps empire running, and two, that keeps us from noticing all the ways that maybe things aren't as they should be, that justice has not been done on earth as it is in heaven. Empire will use shame. And let's just say this, there is no shame in having a work-life balance. I can remember growing up in church, and when the pastor would take a vacation, what people would sometimes say is, well, Satan doesn't take a vacation. And as a kid, it always shocked me a little because I'm like, is that who we're taking cues from? Is that who we're trying to model ourselves after? You regularly find Jesus like slipping away. You find Jesus on a boat in the middle of a storm, taking quite a good nap. It's okay to have a work-life balance. It's okay. It's okay for you to shut your phone off. It's okay for you not to return that call or email till tomorrow. It is okay. There is no shame in having a work-life boundary and balance that allows you to remember you're not just a person who produces things, but you're a human being and you matter and your life matters and how you're doing matters. There is no shame in taking a power or cat nap or any other kind of nap. There's no shame in it. There is no shame in hitting pause and having a really long meal with friends and enjoying yourself and allowing yourself to be poured back into with those relationships. There is no shame in prioritizing our physical and mental health. There just isn't. And we have kind of been led to believe societally that there kind of is. Like, how do you know you're really a good employee? How do you know you're really getting it? Well, I come to work even when I'm, knocking on death's door, I feel like. I show up anyway, right? Like, no. There's no shame in saying, I need a mental health day. There's no shame in saying, I'm sick. I need to see a doctor. There is no shame in taking care of yourself. There is no shame, and this is so important. There is no shame in being kind and compassionate to yourself. And that is a struggle. I get it. If you could hear my inner monologue some days and the way I think about myself and talk about myself, I bet some of you struggle with that same thing too. There is no shame in giving yourself a break and cutting yourself some slack and realizing that you are a human being with all the beauty and complexity and possibility that entails, and also with the limits that come with it. We can only do so much. There are only so many hours in a day. I see this this video is real circling around where this guy's talking about like, you only have 24 hours in a day, but I wake up and I get up at like 3 a.m. and my first 4 hours, that's a day. And then my next, have you seen this video? And it's just like, I don't think that's how days in math work. But there's no shame. There is no shame in being kind and compassionate to yourself and honoring your limits and allowing yourself to be poured back into. Every 7 years, so there was the Sabbath weekly every 7 days, but then every 7 years, there was this thing called the Sabbath year. And one of the things that happened on the Sabbath year is that the land was supposed to lie fallow. It was supposed to be a time of rest for the crops, because the idea was that you can over deplete the nutrients and the life-giving nature of the soil. And so if you give it regular periods of rest, if you rotate your crops, like if you give the land rest, it will be more productive. I think when we rest, we end up being more productive. We end up being more effective. We end up finding more joy in our work. We end up being more creative and more engaged. When we rest, it allows something in our souls and our bodies to be reconnected and rejuvenated, and it pushes us out there when we're back at work, when we're back doing the things we do in the world. And we can do them with more clarity, more efficiency, more effectiveness because we have poured into ourselves. One of the things that happens, and this happened just last month, 2 months ago, I was on an airplane with my kids, and it happened. This happens every time, and I don't know why it surprises me, but it's like I forget it's a thing. And they're going through the instructions before takeoff, and when you're sitting beside, if you've never flown with a little kid, this is what happens. They will always come to you and they'll say, after they say the thing about putting, an oxygen mask, if cabin pressure changes, the oxygen mask will fall. You pull it down and the air is going to flow and you put it on your face. But then they'll always come to you and say, make sure you put your own mask on first before you try to put theirs on. And there's this part of me that's like, okay, I'm going to put the kid's mask on first. But their point is valid, right? Like if you lose consciousness, you can't help other people. If you're exhausted, you can't effectively care. You can't keep pouring out. You're not an endless supply of energy, creativity. You're not an endless supply. We have our limits. And so perhaps on this level, as we unlearn rest, perhaps our new reimagining of rest comes with understanding we have limits. We have so much we can do and give before we are given out. And we need to be poured back into with regular rest and with things that rejuvenate and bring healing and hope and wholeness and all those beautiful things so that then we can go back out into the world and do some good. Are you with me? I really, really hope, Grace Point, that you're finding some time this weekend to do something that brings you joy, something that pours back into you. For everybody, that's not an app. Maybe it's being on the lake. Maybe it's jet skiing. Maybe it's whatever the thing is that brings you joy and life and pours back into you. I hope you're able to find time for that this weekend. And I hope you're able to make time for it in a regular way in your life. We love you. We miss seeing you this weekend, and we can't wait to be with you next weekend. Grace and peace be with you.